Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Goldster Inside Story today. And I'm really thrilled to have with us today on Remembrance Day, Armistice Day, the TV historian and broadcaster Tessa Dunlop. She's going to talk about some of her early books, including Army Girls, but mostly we are going to talk about this book, her brand new book on Elizabeth and Philip. How timely is this? And as you can see, Tessa is looking extremely glamorous and gorgeous, and she's in a TV studio. So how cool is this? I think she's our coolest Goldster guest so far. So Tessa, welcome. Thank you so much for coming along today.
Thank you very much. I am. And do you know what? It's quite a controversial TV channel. I don't know how many of you have heard of GB News. It's the sort of right-wing raggle-taggle, rabble-rousing. I'm looking at you. I think I should be looking at the camera. It's the right-wing rabble-rousing. Nigel Farage is their highest. Is their highest rating presenter. Actually, I'm not going on to talk to Nigel Farage. Andrew Pearce, who's known as Tory Boy, and he writes mainly for the Mail, but of course they go very big on Remembrance Day. Today it's the 11th of November, and we're going to be getting in actually one of my original Bletchley girls, aged 99, and because the very first book I wrote connected to 20th century women and war was, of course, Bletchley Girls.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, because you have got such a busy schedule. I know that you were doing an event last night, and I'm really thrilled that you were able to join us.
No, and in fact, no, it wasn't last night. The other reason I'm cheating, I said to Lucinda, I have to apologize. It hasn't been very sisterly of me. I've come up all zhizhed. I've even actually got fake eyelashes on that I look like a sort of aging Cindy doll. But the reason is, when you've got a book to plug, you are only as good as your last set of book sales. So I went on the Jeremy Vine Channel 5 show this morning, and you go on and you sort of really hope they'll mention your book, but you can't insist. And he always historically is one of the sort of few celebs, and I do consider him a celeb, who's utterly decent and charming. So I think he sort of felt better get to the book out of kindness. Normally he's all over me because everyone loves a war vet from World War II, and this one he was far tougher. What can you tell us that's new about Elizabeth and Philip? So I had to sort of earn my crust a bit more this morning.
And do you think that you did earn your crust?
I think so. Yeah, I do, because I had done original research, but I just noticed the different tone. I'm very aware, and it was a whole other side to working with, and they're all included in Elizabeth and Philip, a lot of them, 7 of them, actually, not all of them, working with society's outliers. So I start 10 years ago with the Bletchley Girls, and so then they were in their early 90s. The oldest was in her late 90s. And then I did Century Girls, and all those women were born in 1918 or before, and I'd just been to the funeral of the final one. Then Army Girls in the pandemic, 17 women who served in World War II in the ATS, the Auxiliary Territorial Service. And that really was, that I found that very, very challenging, because in a pandemic, working with the most vulnerable, they were obviously kind of locked up, basically, often against their will. And 6 of them died in that period when I was working with them.
Wow.
So yeah, it has been, and as a result, though, that the flip side of that was last year I brought out Army Girls, and we were able to change for a week the narrative on war, because it was the 80th anniversary of conscription for women, and there was something deeply pleasing about that. And also it was a magnus opus, but getting 99-year-old Daphne on stage at the National Army Museum, the ego, I always say, the body withers, the ego persists. Anyone who thinks that we become more demure and don't, and I'm sure you'll know this depending on your age, no, we put our ego into different things like grandchildren, or I don't know, whatever one's interest is in older age. But actually, that's a sidestep. Really, if you're a 99-year-old, you love recounting your war stories. And Bletchley girl Pamela, who's also in this book because she knew Prince Philip's girlfriend, she said to me, she died last year aged 103, she said to me, who doesn't like talking about themselves?
It's very true. I find that when I'm researching, you interview people, and it's wonderful what they come up with, because particularly with the older generation who've perhaps been told that, we're all bored with that, their children, their grandchildren, we don't want to hear those stories. So when somebody else is interested, it's wonderful. So tell us about Elizabeth and Philip. How did you get commissioned for this? I mean, I'm assuming it was a bit of a nightmare with the timing recently.
Yeah, so it has been a bit of a nightmare. I'm just checking my hair's still on, but it has been a nightmare. I'll tell you why I wrote the book. When I was doing Army Girls, it was my 3rd book, as I said, about extremely old women. And of course, the Queen was the most famous member of the ATS. She was only in it for 2 months.
Yeah.
She was the pin-up girl. And I think one of the potencies of our late monarch was that she could tie us back to the Blitz, to Churchill. She walked the walk so she could talk the talk. And that was incredibly, it was nostalgic for Britain. It was romantic in many respects. And I thought, as I wrote this book about army girls, why haven't I reached out to the Queen? So I did reach out to her. I got a letter back from her private secretary saying, good luck with the book. And actually I met one of the women in the army girls, Martha, Lady Martha Bruce, her nanny before, because she's 100 now, Martha, she's a bit older than the Queen. Her nanny was Crawfey. And of course,
wow.
you remember the Queen's mother was from the Strathmores, the Scottish aristocratic family, and they poached Crawfey off the Bruces, who were the Duke and the Countess. Is it Duke of Elgin? I can't remember what is. Anyway, of Elgin. If she's a countess, what's he? Mine's gone blank. Anyway, thank you. 10th Earl. I think he was the 9th Earl. Her father was the 9th Earl of Elgin. So the Strathmores poached Crawfey for Elizabeth and Margaret, who at that point weren't in line, direct heirs to the throne. Elizabeth wasn't. That would come obviously when she was 10 years old. So I had these kind of wonderful insights through doing the army girls. And I also knew 2 women, one of whom had trained alongside the Queen at Camberley. So I had ideas about this princess who was, interestingly, Lucinda, she was shy around her peers. She literally had a lockdown in Windsor during the war. She had very little ability to go anywhere or do anything or see anyone.
And they pretended she was in Canada or somewhere, didn't they? She was out of the country.
There was a thought that she might go to Canada, sort of talk rich cars, but then the Queen said, if the children go to Canada, I would have to go to Canada, and I'm not going to go anywhere because the King's not going to go anywhere, and we're staying in Britain. And it was all about the idea of eyeballing the East End, and then Buckingham Palace gets bombed. And it's really the very high noon for actually George VI, who needed a bit of help because he'd replaced his rather more charismatic brother. But so I was very struck. I knew that this princess had been trapped away and didn't have the sort of language of being a teenager around her own age group. And the woman who trained with her, Gwen, remembers that very clearly. And at the same time, she was struck by how confident and composed the princess was in front of the cameras. And why do you think that was a second? Well, she was familiar. She even before she becomes heir to the throne age 10, she is public property. She effectively lives in a goldfish bowl from the get-go. And of course, her uncle David, there's no sign of any progeny from him. So there's quite a lot of early interest in Elizabeth because there are no other offspring so close to the throne as she. So she was, and then of course there's photo shoots in World War II. She's used to putting on the garb, putting on a performance from her father's coronation onwards. So she was very au fait with that. And I noticed that as being a key difference between her and Philip. I think things you do in childhood become second nature, don't they? And that was the case for Elizabeth and cameras. And yet she lacked having the edges knocked off her because she wasn't at school. She didn't stay in barracks when she trained. Barbara, another one of my army girls, also trained at Camberley. She's 97, 9 months older than the Queen.
They really built them for lasting then, didn't they?
Well, I think, but I think we think that, but of course we only now talk to the ones who lasted.
Yes, of course. Yeah. So this idea of doing the 2 of them, I love this. I'm going to show you the book again. I've put a link in the chat as well.
That's kind. Thank you.
I really like the fact that you've done this together. So what a lovely idea to do a joint biography. Where did that idea come from? Did you come up with that? Did your publishers come up with it?
Well, I wanted, it was partly my publisher, but I've had a really big bust up with my editor, like a proper row. I've even unfollowed him on Twitter.
Oh my goodness. Well, that is the modern equivalent of cutting someone. So why did you have such a fallout with your editor?
We'll come to that later. But I did have a proper bust up, and people generally don't. It's not recommendable if you're writing. Maybe you know this if you are writers, of course, because you're only as good as your next commission. But at some point you have to say no, that's a bridge too far. So I blew up the bridge. But just on Elizabeth and on Elizabeth and Philip, I just wanted to go to Barbara, if we may, because she stayed in Camberley, where the trained Queen to be this ATS driver at the end of the war. She's 2 months. Barbara trained there 2 years earlier, and she stayed in the barracks, and she gave me this wonderful account that I put in Elizabeth and Philip. It doesn't go in the Army Girls, actually, because they said, Tessa, there's too much lesbianism in the Army Girls we've had. So I put it in Elizabeth and Philip. And it would basically, Barbara said, well, of course, I was an only, forgive me for doing a Yorkshire accent if you speak in Yorkshire, but to be Barbara, I have to inhabit her. She says, well, of course, she lives in Selby now. She said, of course, the thing about the late Queen is she didn't stay in barracks. She went home to Windsor Castle every night, and I stayed in barracks, and I met all sorts. I was a 17-year-old only child, and my eyes were wide open. And I said, what do you mean, Barbara? And she went, well, there was Marion MacDonald. She was a prostitute. I was like, goodness. She said, yeah, and as rough as hell. I was like, oh, she said, and then she said, but she had a heart of gold. And now I've gone Scottish now. Marion MacDonald was the Glaswegian, Barbara's the Yorkshire one. Anyway, and I said, oh, really? Why? She saved me. I was like, how did she save you? Because she said, young'un. She'd always call me young'un. She was from the Gorbals. Young'un, come here. And Barbara went, what? She was, are you getting bothered by the woman in bed number 2? And Barbara said, oh, she does seem, interested or something. And she said, you need to watch your step. And Barbara said, well, I didn't know what she was talking about. But of course, the woman in bed number 2 was a lesbian. So there was the prostitute protecting Barbara from the lesbian. It was all so dramatic. And of course, Barbara's conclusion is, no wonder the princess didn't get to sleep in barracks.
She wouldn't have been allowed to. All the backgrounds of those other women would have been gone into by all the kind of royal PR people. Did you get any help from the royal? I mean, obviously you had the letter back from the Queen's private secretary. Were you able to go into the Royal Archives? How did you research?
I did the Queen's military archive is in the National Army Museum. And yeah, I did. I went to the National Army Museum, and that's when it struck me just how important she was as a symbol, to be honest. Her aunt, who is very like Princess Anne, and we don't really pay her any attention, originally Princess Mary, of course, and she becomes the Controller Commandant of the ATS, which is this very stodgy, largest military service for women in the Second World War. And I think that gave the Queen very little option. She'd have much rather have been a Wren. Philip, of course, was in the Navy, and it was the glamorous one to be in, but she didn't have a choice. You realise that when you start in the early days of Elizabeth's life, that there was very little choice ever. She was on this very straitjacketed path. Now, some would say, poor girl, others would say, sometimes it's a blessing to have. And also, that generation of women didn't have much choice. Yes, so although the stakes were much higher because she was going to be queen, actually, most girls were biddable. They either did what their parents said, or if they were service girls, they did what their sergeant major said. They didn't complain when men were a pest or when they didn't get paid the same. They just shut up and put up. And then, of course, after the war, 2 million of them were basically told to go back into the home and breed for Britain, quote unquote. So the idea that, oh, poor Queen, she had no agency, is, I think, slightly misrepresentative, because most girls of that age didn't have any agency.
And what did you like the Queen when you were writing about her? I mean, did you feel that you really warmed to her? Was there anything you didn't like? Did you find it a difficult book to write or an easy one?
In some ways, it was quite difficult.
Yeah.
I'll give you a euphemistic story, if I may, that doesn't go in the book. I chatted up Hugo Vickers. That's the other thing. If you're writing a book, you need to chat the right people up. Don't slag off your editor, and chat up the right people. And Hugo Vickers is quite a well-known royal biographer.
It was very helpful to me when I was working on Princess Louise, and I think he's a lovely man. I was generous. Really impressed with how, his generosity towards other writers.
Indeed, he's very generous. And but if you're a royal biographer, and one of the ways you carve your name is by getting access, you also have to be extremely wary of what you write. I don't want to be asked to dinner with Charles, so I was less compromised than some royal biographers are. I do want to be given access to the royal archives, but therefore I just must publish the truth, and it needs to be sourced. But it's not, the stakes aren't as high as they are for some. But he was very kind, and he suddenly said, and we've known each other for, oh my goodness, he said, you are Sir Derek Dunlop's granddaughter. And this is the only famous person in my family. He was actually the grandson of a baker. His father was a doctor, and Sir Derek was knighted for his services to medicine. And I said, yes, I am. And he said, Sir Derek Dunlop was the lover of the Duchess of Buccleuch. Now, if you knew my grandfather, and here I wish I had a visual, he was a Scotsman. He was a renowned physician, as they were called in those days. He's the only successful person in my family. And he was married to Marjorie, who had a face like a fist, looked a bit like the Queen on a glum day, to be honest with you. You know, those women whose face isn't set to break into a smile. And we always thought Marjorie was pretty hard work and Derek definitely had all the charm. There was this rumor about the Duchess of Buccleuch. Scottish society is quite tight and it's quite hierarchical, especially then. Anyway, he sent me these letters from the Duchess of Buccleuch. Remember, she's one whisker away from the royal family, saying she was highly sexed and had a lot of affairs, as the aristocrats did hugely between the wars. And she said, I really can't bear men. After they cease to be your lovers, they become cads, with the exception of Derek Dunlop. He has always declared his love for me, and I believe him. So there I had this hard proof that indeed my grandfather was the lover of the Duchess of Buccleuch, as well as being, of course, the husband of Marjorie, my grandmother. And of course, let's not pretend it stopped with the Duchess of Buccleuch. He was quite a good looking guy. He was on the ward, you can imagine. And that made it underlined. And that helped me a bit understand the nature of marriage and how it's changed. And it dramatically changed after the Second World War, when girls who'd been in the military services, they weren't going to get to have big professional jobs and they didn't expect them. The cachet of men was very, very high. What you wanted to do was bag a man. So the princess was no different, with her beady eyes set on Fit Philip because he was hot. But they did expect a companionate marriage. And this very much changed. Before the wars, it was all about an independent marriage. So my grandfather would be a fine example of that, where monogamy wasn't prioritized, at least not from the male point of view. And you might have quite different pursuits and interests, but the marriage was maybe affectionate, might be convenient, good for progeny, all sorts of different reasons why people would marry. But these romantic ideas associated with marriage and the exclusivity that people expected grew and grew. And so you have this companionate idea of marriage after the war, which, as the Marriage Commission said, well, this is just going to raise the stakes of marriage and you're going to get more divorce, which is, of course, precisely what happens. But people marry in love. They go down the aisle. 1947, the year Elizabeth and Philip married, was the biggest year for peacetime marriages ever. A record number crashed down the aisle, and the age fell to a record-breaking 22 for brides. And it was expected that the couple was in love, and they expected sexual gratification and an exclusivity, sexually, emotionally, etc. And I don't know, certainly in terms of having more independent worlds and stuff, I don't know if that Philip and Elizabeth, who came, of course, from a very different aristocratic setup, necessarily fully bought into that companionate model. And I'm talking euphemistically here, of course, to an extent, but the expectation by society post-war was that theirs would be a companionate marriage. Certainly that was what was hoped for, and I did a massive trawl through the newspaper archives, and people were very wary of the idea of a foreign prince marrying our princess. But in all, especially the left-wing press that started polling people, and people wrote in, particularly women were very keen to know that Elizabeth loved Philip and that it was a marriage based on love. I find that really interesting.
Yeah, it is. And do you believe that it was a marriage based on love?
I know that Elizabeth was absolutely set on Philip from the age of 14 because she kept cuttings of him in her scrapbook, press cuttings. She met him when she was 13, and she was putting in pictures of him in her scrapbook age 14. We know this because of the Fitzalan Howard diaries. And we know that they then meet several times, in Christmases, because of course he's her third cousin, they overlap. So to an extent, he's to the manor born, but he's also dashing. He's really very, very good looking. I have to admit, one of the incentives, I talked about the Army Museum, for some unknown reason, in a large, one of those large flat drawers, that you get in archives. And I pulled it open. Remember, he was in the Navy, so I pulled it open, and there he was in all his military finery. I couldn't believe my eyes. I mean, he was really potent. And of course, can you imagine, you're locked away as a princess. This is before she even went in the ATS, very briefly at 18. And this extraordinarily hot blonde prince comes throbbing into Windsor Castle and blows away some of the stuffiness. He was sort of as vulgar. The Queen Mother, as she later became, didn't like him. I mean, I was very struck by that.
Right.
They didn't buy into him.
I thought
no.
Behind it.
No, her family were very mean, especially the Queen Mother. The Strathmores, they're a bit Scotland. I know this because I grew up in Scotland, thanks to Sir Derek. Oh, by the way, just a line on Sir Derek Dunlop. he was head of the Drug Safety Board. It was originally the Dunlop Drug Safety Board. And one of the first tasks they were given in the 1960s was to pass the contraceptive pill for women as safe to use. And here's the wonderful irony. He looked at all the science and said, well, I can see no reason why this can't be passed as safe to use. He said, but of course, I do worry about it leading to a more promiscuous society. And there was he with the judges of Bacloon.
Well, it's always do as I say and not as I do, isn't it?
But look, we've had a message.
Yeah.
I met my husband when I was 14 and we've been in love over 55 years.
That's
so
wonderful.
sweet.
Thank you for sharing, and congratulations.
Yeah.
Making it to 55 years. That's amazing.
Yeah, that's so cool. I am going to tell a story that's often misconstrued, but I actually met my husband when he was 12. And I write that in the book, that you can see the imprint of the adult in the younger person. You don't fall in love with them, but I think there is can be a profound, certainly sort of weird connection. And I went back, but he wasn't a Greek prince. He was a Romanian peasant. But I went back to fight him when I was 19. And when he was 18, he was 18. And I, by that stage, was 20. Because I was 8 years older than him. It's 26. Yeah. So that was also, my parents didn't approve, but of course it didn't matter because it was a more modern era. But going back to Philip, that there was huge hostility towards him. And Lascelles said, oh, he's this and that and unlikely to be faithful. There was, I think, a bit like we saw with Meghan Markle, when someone's staggeringly beautiful, doesn't matter what you think of Meghan, really. I think it's an objective truism to say she's a beauty. And she's foreign and she doesn't have the financial clout of the royal family. Just as Philip, although he came from royalty, he was sixth in line to the dubious Greek throne. He was unquestionably beautiful. As Daphne in the book says, Daphne, my 99-year-old, she was also in the ATS. She said, well, the thing is about Philip, he was absolutely beautiful. Whereas Elizabeth, well, she could look nice. So the point is, here's a man who's aesthetically more potent than the woman he's going to marry. And that, of course, threw up questions of why is Philip, the whiff of the fortune hunter. Here's a man who needs a realm. And Elizabeth gifted him that. But that doesn't mean that, you can fall in love with people for a whole load of reasons. She represented a steadfastness that he lacked. What we do know is he early on had extremely glamorous girls. I did pursue that line a bit because of my Bletchley girl connection. So Osla Benning was one of his famously one of his girlfriends before he commits to Elizabeth. And Pamela worked at Bletchley Park. She was a bit older. And her job as an older debutante was to control the younger ones. And she just said, I just remember Osla being utterly stunning. Osla was one of the women who careened down the corridor in a laundry basket with as she was latterly known, the Duchess Baroness Trumpington. And these girls were quite hard to discipline and they were raring to go, but very innocent at the same time, quite young. And of course, terribly worried about becoming soiled goods, in inverted commas. Course, yes. And everybody knew Pamela. I have this on good authority from Pamela, who didn't get to go to the grave with her secrets. She told me on good authority that we all knew she was dating a Greek prince. And then Pamela said in one of her wonderful asides, she said, when I eventually met him, I was so disappointed by how traditional and English he seemed.
Because he does look classically English. I mean, so many of the photographs, and people probably at the time were just, as you say, prejudiced against him because he was foreign. What's the press?
I don't know. Interestingly, I don't think he does look very English. I think he's too blonde and clean cut. If you think of the sort of chinless wonders that were being paraded around, there's a few sort of grenadier guards who the poor princess had to dance with, and they're pretty chinless. I mean, he was a far finer model in many respects than the other men. The Windsor girls, let's not forget Peter Townsend, who Margaret fell in love with. They had a keen sense of the kind of man they wanted.
Yes.
Quite right too. They weren't going to be married off with some chinless stiff. So they did buy into, interestingly, both girls bought into this companionate marriage model. And I also feel no doubt that it was so life-changing for Philip and he very early on, he said he was writing to Elizabeth when she was 14, 15. We know that because his cousin, ex-Queen of Yugoslavia, comments on it. And she said, well, why are you writing to him? She's a baby. Why are you writing to her? She's a baby. He challenges him. But why was he writing to Elizabeth when she was 14, 15?
Perhaps he could see, as you said about your own husband, you can see the adult they're going to become. And she was so crazy about him. I mean, it's very touching when you look at her teenage years, how much she adored him. Now, you said how, you made the correlation between him and Meghan Markle. Were the British press as vile to Philip as they are to Meghan Markle. I find it shocking the way that she's treated in the press. Were they the same towards him, or was it just?
Yeah, they were. They were, but they were bought in line in a way that you could nobble editors in those days.
Yeah.
One of the reasons, there's several reasons why they were wary of Philip, and one is his uncle. This is where all the lines cross over. If you remember, up until the First World War, the royal dynasties married, and isolationist Britain. Victoria gave her progeny to most of the royal houses across Europe. Suddenly, in the First World War, first cousins are fighting first cousins, right up to the pinnacle of the top of the royal households. So that totally changes the script. George V changed the rules. Suddenly, the British royal family, they're Windsors. They dump their German tag, and also they're allowed to marry commoners, which of course Elizabeth's father does. With it, she's a pretty posh commoner. I mean, she goes back to Robert the Bruce, but and that's what all the press were like. Oh well, we would like our princess to marry a Brit. That's kind of to tone in the press post-war, and it's also picked up by a lot of the courtiers. They didn't feel Philip was, if you're going to marry a foreigner, the right sort of foreigner. He had too much German. He wasn't Hellenic. He was from the Greek, sixth in line to the Greek throne, which didn't help his cause because they had flirted with the fascists before the war, and they were in all sorts of mess after the war. But he also had a dump load of Teutonic or German blood. His sisters were all married to Germans. And we were feeling so insecure that they weren't even allowed to be invited to the wedding in 1947. None of the sisters turned up to the wedding. And in the press, people do this Sunday Pictorial, which is quite a left-leaning paper. Yes, he also did have a Danish connection. He was Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark. The Greek line was the active line, as it were, but it was through his grandfather that he was connected also to Denmark, which helps explain this Germanic blood. But I think, by the time, after 1 year, when he's 1 year old, they're exiled from Greece, and he grows up all over the shop, and his father ends up in the Riviera with a lover, and his mother goes to a sanatorium. I mean, it's a pretty patchy upbringing, but I can't remember the question you asked.
No, I was just asking if the press was as horrible.
Yeah, they were, and they did all these polls and said we want Elizabeth, and the polls were inconclusive about whether people approved of Philip. And then Lord Mountbatten gets involved. Mountbatten's a really key player. I had no idea until I started the book just what a key player he was, and therefore, interestingly, what a massive loss. We always think of that loss in terms of Prince Charles's relationship with Mountbatten when he was blown up by the IRA in the late 70s. But actually, I think it had a profound impact on Philip. Mountbatten, after Mountbatten's brother dies, he's really Philip's main man in Britain. And he's, of course, very suave. He's viciously ambitious. He has a very successful Second World War. He is Philip's uncle. His mother, let me get this right, was born in Windsor Castle. Lest we forget, Philip was the great-great-grandson of Victoria, like Elizabeth were. They were actually third cousins, Elizabeth and Philip. And Mountbatten is also a cousin of King George VI. So it is, again, I'll say that word, to the manor born. But Philip has seen, he's entitled. He knows he's special. He always signs himself the Prince of Greece, but he has no money. He has no realm. He has no real family. He has nowhere to stay. He's staying in a camp bed in Mountbatten's house. And Mountbatten is the one that writes to all the editors of the newspapers, especially the Beaverbrook Press, and says, toe the line. This guy is a Brit, and he works really hard to have Philip naturalized in 1947. That's one of the last hurdles, that Philip's British. We basically sort of recast Philip to be a Brit because it fits the tone and the national British post-war British anxiety.
And did you find those letters that Mountbatten wrote? Are they in the
those letters are very, and he writes to people like, I'm going to say his name wrong, and I bet you one of your listeners, Tom Digbread. He was a gay Labour MP who was also a columnist and quite a prolific writer, and they have long exchanges. And Mountbatten, even when he becomes the last Viceroy of India, is writing to Tom and really batting, because of course it's the socialist government in power at this time. So there's been a sea change. And George VI, I mean, he does a fairly good job of remaining politically neutral, but I think it'd be safe to say he felt much more comfortable with the Conservatives.
So you wrote this. Well, this is the latest book, and it is beautiful. But you've also written lots of other books, and it is Armistice Day today. So tell us about Army Girls first. I mean, I think this is a really lovely cover as well.
I've had my. Can I take? Because it didn't really. I felt a little bit hurt because I thought it was a well-written book. In fact, I'm just going to do you know, on Twitter, I don't really like Twitter. There's a lot of virtue signaling that goes on, and there's what's known as the humble brag, Well, it's all about vanity and posturing, and some people are really good at it, where they seem to be sort of saying, oh, little me, but look what I've achieved, you know, that kind of and I don't fit really in the more right wing kind of, there's a sort of more centre right, Saul David and types of men who write about war and a bit more conventional, you know, and then there's this sort of quite lefty, often feminist agenda or anti-imperial agenda, who big Twitter followings, and I don't fit into either camp really, just like I don't fit into the Sussex camp or the kind of firm, the firm camp, and so you can feel a bit buffeted around. And I felt a little bit hurt because Army Girls, I just knew it was an unusual book. I had 17 women who now I think there's 10 alive. So I was catching these women in a pandemic in the last part of their life, and they were historical game changers in terms of their military experience. And it had the word girls in the title, which meant that the left didn't really feel they could back it. And of course, it wasn't boys' history. But on Amazon, it's the only book I've ever written where all the reviews are 5-star. So I have to say that's never happened before. And I thought, well, none of the big papers reviewed it, whatever. And then I'm going to say this because this is my humble brag. If I was on Twitter, I haven't put it on Twitter because I don't know how to frame it with that. But I got a review from the International Review, Chatham House, saying, this week. So too late to put on the paperback.
Oh, wow.
This week. Yeah. And I thought, and it's amazing how it's so silly. It doesn't make any difference to any sales or any difference to anything, but it does make you feel something like that. It does make you feel, especially it makes you feel validated. Yeah, it does. Tell
everybody about the premise of this, because I think it's really quite wonderful. When did you start writing it? Did someone come up with the idea? Did you?
I did the Bletchley Girls. Obviously, that was something I didn't. Hello, Geeta's waving. I love these things. How do you get to see what everyone's saying? That's quite cool. Will we click on the chat and see what people are saying? Yes, we've
actually got a comment which from earlier that my aunt was at Bletchley Park during World War II.
Oh gosh, what did she do? I'd be really interested to know what hut she worked.
We'll let her put that back in the chat.
Andrew Pearce, Daily Mail, and Kevin Maguire, Daily Mail. Very funny when they do the press review on Sky News. Oh, well, I'm here in GB News. As you can see, there's the newsroom. If you turn it around, you can see. Can you see the newsroom?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, and I said, I'll only come in and do an interview if I can. And the blue matches my top. It's been really marvelous service they've provided. I don't actually know who owns GB News. Anyway, it's doing better than the Rupert. Doing better than the Rupert Murdoch one. My nan is 97. She'd probably have similar stories. Oh, it was clapping, not waving. There we are. Sorry to jump down a rabbit hole of messages. Thank you for those messages. This is fun. So yeah, so this is actually, but what now? I don't know. I definitely felt that I was offered PhD funding to do a PhD, and I took it. I found it very, very hard to do a PhD in middle age because the funding's great, but it doesn't cover the cost of living, obviously, in middle age. But also, it's just really hard work, a PhD, and I think you need to be quite alone. And I have children, and it was way more than I thought it would be. And because we live in such a naff world, it has made such a difference being Dr. Tessa Dunlop. And this is where I'm not big on the gender thing. I think I'm really happy with being a woman, but I definitely think it makes a difference as a woman. My blonde hair and my books with Elizabeth or girls in the title, and just being a doctor. But the problem was I built a bit of debt up I got the funding and that, but I built a bit of debt up doing the PhD. And so when I came out of doing the PhD in 2020, I had to think I need to write a quick book. And I have to write quite quickly. So if my advances are about 25 grand, so you have to write quite, you've got to be quite muscular about how you go about it to make sure that you make a living. And I just saw the Army Girls as I knew about conscription for women being introduced in December because I'd done it for Bletchley Girls and Century Girls. I just knew that date, and I knew nobody else would really have known about it. And I thought, right, that is the absolutely perfect anniversary for catching the very last of these women. And I knew, because I'd worked with them twice before, that they are dying, and so I just knew that I needed to write Army Girls, and I wanted to write Army Girls because the ATS, this Queen's service, and this explains why Princess was pulled into this service, was the biggest service. It was the one that relied heavily on conscription, helped man the gun sites and so forth. And they sent girls overseas to support the Allied invasion post 1944. And that was very difficult. Parents didn't want to let their daughters go. Obviously, the princess wasn't allowed to go, naturellement. But Winston Churchill's daughter was, Mary. but I wanted to catch that because it was interesting social history. It's also really interesting in terms of military history, how you sail to a nation where the bedrock of peaceful Britain was about the gender divide, the fecund lovely at home that men are fighting for. And that didn't change. We didn't shift that gendered bedrock. That remained the same. And the way they got around it and the steam that was coming off the bald paps in the War Office was extraordinary. The way they got around it was by saying that girls were non-combatants. So they had this really bizarre situation. It's a bit like sort of COVID rules. If you dig into it, none of it makes sense. So what you have are these girls who are recruited to help behind the guns on the gun sites. So the gun sites were anti-aircraft command, like the roof over Britain, against the Blitz, and then the V1, I think the V1, the doodle bugs, not the rockets. The rockets couldn't really be stopped. And of course, Nazi, the Luftwaffe invasions, etc. So these gun sites were all over Britain. There's more than 1,000. They need huge numbers of personnel. What you have is not enough men. And then you get the dross, the men who aren't fit to go overseas. And there's a wonderful quote. And I've head of the command, Tim, because I'm on Elizabeth and Philip, I've forgotten his name, but he's a wonderful feminist, much more feminist than most of the women who are running the ATS. And he says, oh my God, he's pushing for women silently. Even before the war, he knows he's going to need women. But he says, it's hopeless. 1 in 5 of the women I get is deficient. His thumbs don't work. His glass eye falls out when he doubles over the gun, or he's in the latter stages of venereal disease. He's absolutely apoplectic with rage. And the way they get it through the War Office and get it through Parliament is by saying that girls won't pull the triggers of the guns. Because these giant guns, men have to fire, but the girls do everything. They do all because by this time it's high tech, which is why you need bright people. So you have the height finder, for example, a predictor, these giant machines that are working out when or what level of fuse you need, the timing, when the gun needs to be fired. That's all done by women. So the man literally is the one firing the gun, but the girls aren't allowed to load the gun and they're not allowed to pull the trigger. It's much bigger than a trigger, actually. He's sitting on the gun. This man. But the irony is this means that you can't, the medal you win therefore, or if you die, the way you're commemorated is different because as a female, you're a non-combatant. So you can't win a combat medal. Yeah. Of course, you're just as likely, and I did meet Daphne's best friend died because shrapnel falls out of the sky. Often your own shrapnel coming back at you, pierces you in the forehead, goes beneath, you're dead. It doesn't matter whether you're a combat or a non-combatant. It doesn't make you any safer. It's absolute nonsense.
The same amount of danger.
Yeah. And then at the guardhouse, men had rifles. So if the Nazis had successfully invaded Britain, girls were only allowed a baton. Who goes there? I go, only got, you don't have it. And then when they get to go overseas, when Joan stays in occupied Germany, is part of the occupying, Germany when they go from foe to friend. But initially, we're really scared of the Nazis, even when we managed to kill most of them. So like 5 million German soldiers died. It's quite staggering to get your head around that, isn't it? But anyway, how they rebooted so quickly. But Joan's there now. They can't go out of their camp unless they're in twos and escorted by an armed soldier. And they have to be armed. And then later on, the men aren't allowed out unless they're armed, but the women can't be armed. So they're allowed out without any arms. So you're actually... Women are more vulnerable, arguably, although you could say, well, if you've got,
more vulnerable.
Yeah. Although sometimes some might argue, well, if you've got a gun, that makes you more likely to. Do you see what I mean? Like it's like an escalation of force. But I don't buy that argument. So there was loads of interesting contradictions, and also the women themselves were fascinating in the way in which they remembered the war, and they're very loyal to the hero boys. And then you read their letters as teenagers, and they're always complaining to their friends about being groped. That was the other thing. Like they're constantly groped. So one of the great worries and why we don't want to let the girls over, and they're groped not by Germans, they're not allowed near the Germans, they're groped by 2 million Allied soldiers who haven't seen a woman for a very long time, and they're totally outnumbered.
Had all this in the press recently, the number of women today who are talking about having been sexually assaulted in the military.
But now we talk about it. But then, and what's interesting about these women is, I would read in their letters, they would write home and say, I'm being driven by distraction by this man. He's literally stalking Joan. She can't get away from him. But then when you ask her, age 99, what is important to her is remembering the right war to fight, the good boys of Britain. So the commemoration of the war is a separate historical narrative, the way in which, and understandably, but I found it interesting paralleling those two narratives, because what happened at the time, and Jean went to Italy And she was with the Fannies, the first aid nursing yeomanry. He loosely came under the ATS umbrella. And she's drinking quite heavily. She's smoking. She's just 18. And she has this frightful time fending off men at the end of nights. I mean, it was fascinating to her. And she actually, well, I can't be indiscreet actually about what happens after the war, but it depends in the mood you get her as to how much she'll share with you. But the reason I know this is because all the cachet of letters she sent to her sister still exist.
Brilliant. Gosh, letters are such a wonderful thing as a historian.
Yeah, they are.
I think historians of the future are going to have such a nightmare because there's going to be so much kind of dross in emails, and you would really have to.
Well, we won't have access to them in the same way. You know, there's a whole, but history for our generation is so much easier than for the generation that's going to come. But I would also say of Elizabeth, that was really interesting to me about Elizabeth, not less so Philip in the early years, but Elizabeth's super aware that almost anything she writes might end up in the public domain at some later stage, I think, and therefore her letters are pretty anodyne, you know, that's the truth. But you can understand why.
I can totally understand why.
Yeah.
But a question here, wasn't Israel the first to accept women soldiers?
Yes, I think yes, arguably. See, well, my ladies would say, oh, well, we were the first because Eisenhower copied our mix. They were seen latterly as very successful, the mixed heavy gun AA command gun sites. But I think what you mean is on the front line. So I don't know. I think that Israel, because it happened very, very late in Britain in 2018 under Sir Gavin Williamson, just like my great-grandfather. Perhaps that Sir wasn't as entirely owned as it should have been with Gavin, but it was under Gavin Williamson, I think, as Defence Secretary, that women were allowed into all areas of the army. I've always thought, though, that by focusing on the need to turn women into combatants, I believe, you know, strongly that I pro that move. Martha Bruce, who went on, who's the Queen's, knew the Queen and had a nanny, she became, later in the TA, she became a lieutenant, and she's anti that move. She thought, oh no, women, she wasn't pro it, you know, she's a product of her time. But where we both think that the narrative loses out is that we don't, in talking about women in the army, we fail to recognize the unique strengths and the positives of having women in an army. And so often it's about winning hearts and minds, whether if you're in Kosovo, or if even in Iraq, controversially, or of course Afghanistan, if you've got, it's about winning the peace, really, isn't it? Or and which we so often fail to do. And people are much more likely to approach you and trust you if you're actually a female soldier, and all the evidence suggests that. And actually, Ali Brown, ex-Colonel Ali Brown, talked to me very openly about that, how that on the ground in somewhere like Kosovo, it would be her that would be approached, not the man. So yeah, Ali Brown can pull a trigger, but actually what Ali Brown also offered was this a more empathetic face of British soldiering.
Yeah. We have a comment again from Iris, who said about her aunt being at Bletchley Park. She said, my aunt was a tea lady. You'd have loved to interview her. She lived to 104 and had several. That's astonishing, 104. Wow. And I bet she had some amazing stories, because, you know, do people.
Why can't I see that message?
Oh, that was sent directly to me. Some messages are sent directly.
Oh, was it? Ooh, hark at you, Lucinda.
You can put any messages in here and you can send them straight to me, or you can send them. So we have such a lively, interesting talk. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Somebody else said, were you always a writer? You know, I had a different career. I signed an NDA. I sued a man for being a sex pest, and then I had to change career.
Wow.
Owning it before Me Too and before Jimmy Savile, actually. Before it was trendy, I like to think of myself as a pioneer.
Yeah, good for you.
There you go. So then I had to do something different. So I had to quickly find another career. There was about 6 years where I think, oh God, I might have to sell the house. Yeah, but you make it through. You just keep muscling on, don't you? And then I think the same years, I did about 5 years of literally nothing, like hardly anything, like feeling really scared. Married to a Romanian, so I went and did a little bit of sort of world service stuff that paid threepence in Romania, hid with my mother-in-law, who I think, and then I did an MA in my free time. I've self-funded my MA about a Romanian queen who was actually obviously the first cousin of George V, born in England in Eastwell. I really want to write that book, but I can't get a publisher to back a foreign queen. It's really annoying.
Well,
So
you never know. Times always change.
do you think they do? Well, I'll try again. I always try every year. But anyway, back to Romania just quickly. So I did this MA, and that's what got me funding for the PhD. And in that way that, you know, no buses come and then a lot come. So I'd done 5 years of, it was just grim. You know, it's grim if you want to be working and you don't. I had a baby. It was just chaos. And then suddenly I got PhD funding and the offer to write the Bletchley Girls in the same year. That's kind of, but don't you think life works a bit like that?
It does work like that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have a question here. Did Philip's mother go to their wedding?
Yes, she did. And in fact, this idea that, Philip, I want to show you a picture. Can we show you the picture?
Yes,
so I've obviously got this little crush on Romania. And as a result, I've always had this affection for Philip because I think of him as a Balkan prince. He was way too good looking to be an English one. And he came from Greece, and of course when we think of Greece, think of the Parthenon and etc., and the great sort of Periclean orations and democracy. But actually I think it's really easy to forget that we lumped Greece very much in with the perfidious Balkans. There'd been that first Balkan War, and then the second one that was seen to trigger the First World War. Greece didn't have high cachet. We save it in inverted commas after the Second World War, and it's the famous deal with Stalin. You can have trashy old Romania and Bulgaria and whatever, but we're going to keep Greece, thank you very much, no matter that the communists have helped keep out the fascists in the Second World War. So I really I kind of find it really interesting, that idea of Philip's Greek heritage. And his aunt, no, wait, let me get this right, actually his first cousin, but she was a lump older than him, was Helena of Romania. She becomes the Queen of Romania. She marries the notorious Carol of Romania, who abdicates, a bit like Edward. They were very similar in many ways. And he abdicates Carol, and Michael, who is therefore the first cousin once removed of Philip, is King of Romania. I hope you're keeping up. Questions later, in 1928. And through my Romanian connections, I got my favorite picture of Philip of all time, and I got to use it in the book, which I'm just going to have to share with you now. Where is it? Here, of Philip, because of course he's got this broken home. He's in exile. His mum's in a sanatorium. His dad's having affairs in the Riviera. I mean, anyone who talks about Philip, he didn't have, if you want to do the psychobabble bit on Philip, monogamy did not have high stakes in his family. No. Mountbatten and his notorious marriage, his father in the Riviera, his big uncle George married to Bonaparte. Anyway, won't go there. Let's focus on Philip as a little boy. Can you see there? There he is on the Black Sea coast, riding a donkey in Mamaia in Romania. And the one on the donkey, he's actually on a horse. I had to quickly change that at the end because I realized that's a horse. But the little donkey is King Michael of Romania, aged something like 7. And that shows what crazy childhoods they have. And then about 20 years later, of course, 1947, all the newspapers in Britain went mad because King Michael of Romania, who's done the volte-face, is it volte-face or volte-face? I never know how to say that word, but anyway, did the turnaround, when Romania turned the guns on the Germans in 1944. Effectively, Romania managed to lose the war twice. But anyway, so he's a bit of a sort of seen on the right side of history briefly, because of course he's going to get biffed off his throne by the communists. But the communists are camping in his country already, and he's got this really uneasy thing going on with these, basically the Red Army and the Russian parachiks who have arrived in Bucharest. But when he arrived at the wedding, he's still just clinging onto his throne. The Yugoslavian queen, who's also a cousin of Philip's, lost hers, but she's at the wedding too. So he flies his own aeroplane. He's a tall, good-looking guy, Michael, by the way, a bit like Philip. He flies his own aeroplane to London to come to their wedding. And all the headlines, and of course, Philip's, you can imagine him being well gel, because Philip always wanted to be in the RAF, was sort of hobbled into the Navy by Mountbatten. And he always wanted to learn to fly, and he doesn't learn to fly until the coronation year, and then against the advice of Churchill. And here's Michael stealing all the headlines, rocking up to the wedding, where he meets his future wife, goes back to Romania to lose his crown. And that's where you think, for the grace of God, Philip was lucky to get Elizabeth. Absolutely. He could have been a Balkan prince losing, in Yugoslavia or in Romania with a lot less. And then poor old Michael has to sort of come back and grout around and pretend to be a chicken farmer with his 5 daughters because he's lost his throne. And Philip is quite a convenient relation in that respect.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. God, that's so fascinating, isn't it? And how everything connects. You talked earlier about how each book, I find this as well, each book grows out of the previous book because you come up with someone and think, gosh, they're really fascinating. So tell us about the Bletchley Girls and the Century Girls. How did you meet these extraordinary?
So the Bletchley Girls was the first. Isn't it weird? The Bletchley Girls is by far my best-selling book, and it's the least well written. Although this has got the most number of typos, but that's my editor's fault. The don't go there. He's left now, by the way. He's left the publishing company. Where were we? We were on books. Yeah. So Bletchley Girls was my first book, and I had to write it quite quickly because the film was coming out, and people always want something when there's a film attached because they think that'll get you a bit of puff.
Yes.
And therefore they approached me. And the reason I got approached was because I'd written a book that didn't get published. Well, I self-published it more or less, which I wish I hadn't in some ways. Anyway, To Romania with Love. It was a little memoir about Romania because I just needed, when I was going through those years of tumbleweed. But he'd read it and I think he saw I could write. And then the person they wanted to get to write the book fell through, who was a man. And actually, I think it was a much better product placement to have a woman write the Bletchley Girls, because what was really interesting about them was partly what they did, of course, and how they were recruited. But it was also about that idea, the juxtaposition of femininity in a masculine war, and also about becoming a young woman in that time. Oh, just an aside on war. Obviously, we've got this horrific war going on. And I know I feel quite connected to it because obviously my in-laws live up on the Ukrainian-Romanian border. But, and the first time I went to work in Romania was just after the revolution in 1992. And you looked out we could look out, it was on Siret, and you could look out onto Ukraine. And you've got to watch it on iPlayer. I mean, you will need to watch it in chunks, but Mariupol, The People's Story, it was a panorama. I don't know if any of you saw it. 90 minutes, just, yeah. God, it's on now, and it just stops you in your tracks. I think the tendency is, especially because we talk to these really wonderful veterans and they take us back to a quite a nostalgic time for the British narrative, pre the imperial abyss and the sort of self-flagellation and the diminishment in our global size and so forth, politically. And I think this tendency sometimes to turn the Second World War into a bit of a fairy tale the further away we get from it.
Absolutely.
And I think that Mariupol documentary, I just recommend it. I think we have to watch stuff that challenges us, and it really keyed me into what's going on in Europe. And God, it's bloody awful. God, it was just, yeah.
I've been thinking that a lot this year with kind of, Armistice Day coming up, thinking we romanticize war so much. And
yeah. Yeah, we do.
I'm aware of what people are living in. Just,
and also, I don't like it when people say, "Oh, we are fighting Ukraine." No, we're not. We're not. The cost of eggs has gone up, and I get all that, but we're not fighting Ukraine. We're not fighting Russia.
No, we're absolutely not. And what those people are living through is horrendous.
Hell, it's absolutely horrendous. It was just beautiful. The other thing is, I've always been this sucker for East Europe. I just love their slightly showy fashion, and I just love it. They're sort of pink anoraks, and I just love them. We were so lucky to have them. And I always felt, funnily enough, and it's a bit political, I was just rightly corrected by Jeremy Vine on air, and I said that we literally raped those countries for their young workers. But I felt really acutely that in Romania, you couldn't get a doctor, you couldn't get a vex. They were all in the West. We benefited. So, and now we're missing them, eh? But in a way, I always felt quite confused about freedom of movement. I was always pro the European project, because I just felt it was such appalling brain drain for those countries, and so quickly it was. And they pay to train their own doctors, and we steal them, and that just felt really.
What that's like is everybody goes to work.
Yeah, I always put boots on the other foot. Anyway, that was just a political comment. I don't even know how I went there. Oh, anyway, I didn't mean to go there, but I just always have loved that East European sort of flashiness. Anyway, but in Ukraine, there was this in Mariupol, there was this wonderful anaesthetist, just totally sort of East European and beautiful, and in a way that an anaesthetist in Britain you couldn't imagine looking quite like that, and she was telling the story, and then suddenly the bomb had gone off, and she was putting and I think we have to own this is what, and we did this, I always think that always struck me, and I talked about it a lot with the veterans. In our Blitz, 60,000 civilians died, not just in the Blitz, but in the whole war. 60,000 British civilian dies because of German bombing, because of enemy bombing. We killed 400,000 German civilians. So 10 times the number. And I don't think we ever really explore that, because it's all quite uncomfortable in the narrative, and you had to kill the bad enemy and so forth. But it doesn't really matter, does it? If your country's run by Nazis, or if it's run by Winston Churchill, if you're being bombed as a woman, and this Mariupol scene where this woman is being packed into a plastic bag, a pregnant woman, her dead baby in her. And it's just, you just think, it's utterly devastating this is happening. They're us. These people are us.
It's so hard to actually get your head around the scale of what is happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to take you back quickly because we haven't got much time. We've had a
Oh, sorry.
Now we've gone back to another your earlier book, to well, the one we talked about at the beginning, your latest book. Didn't Philip have an extramarital affair with someone called Elizabeth Grey? So we're going straight from war and the sorest topic of the moment to some gossip.
Yes. Well, I don't know so much about Elizabeth Grey. I plumbed the line of Pat Kirkwood more, and I did some interview for the Mail. You have to be really careful when you're being interviewed by the Mail what you say, because they'll just rip out the most sensational headline and that'll be with you for life. That might get you barred from the Royal Archives. But somebody did leave.
Or you can write about Princess Louise, that gets you barred from the Royal Archives anyway.
Does it? Have you been barred for doing that? Why were you barred?
They won't let you in if you want to research Princess Louise.
What? Oh, interestingly. Okay, so that's not about you, it's about the subject.
Yes.
Well, of course, none of us are allowed anywhere near Philip's will for 90 years. I ask you why not? Because only an act of parliament prevents us from seeing the monarch's will. And the first time we were barred from seeing a member of the royal family's will was when it was Mary of Teck's brother, I think, in 1910. And that's because he had had an affair with a woman. And we weren't to know about the gift, the jewels that he was gifting this woman. So there are questions about why Philip, and the Guardian, good old lefty Guardian, contested this and got battered back with a lot of legal gobbledygook. I write about it in the book, actually, because I thought it was quite interesting. But it was quite a fine line, especially when the monarch is so late monarch has recently died. But I think they had this independent marriage, like I say. But when I did this Daily Mail thing, one of the comments below the line, generally I try and avoid them because people troll you really badly when you talk about the royal family or indeed the Sussexes. But one of the lines was, oh, I think Tessa did a very good job there of saying the Queen knew something about how to keep Philip in the porch or something, like, you know. The press was very interesting around this time. People like Daphne, who were alive and remembered it unfolding, it was very interesting. The Queen cut Philip a lot of slack. He was given quite a hard time by the likes of Churchill, not supportive of Philip, by the way, at all. They all wanted access to this lovely peaches and cream Queen, Lassells and Churchill and all the old buttocks, by the way, who were past their sell by date. And they certainly didn't want a flash duke with an ambiguous job title getting in the way. So I think he, he's an alpha man in a beta role, and I think that had challenges. But and that also was challenges of writing about that. I would say the great loser in all of this was Charles, because there was an expectation that Charles could marry in a sort of similar pattern with a big puffy dress and lots of romantic stuff said about weddings. And they didn't have the foundations that Philip and Elizabeth had, or indeed the affection, but also they lived in a different era. And I think because there was this frozen idea of marriage from Elizabeth and Philip, we forgot there'd been this extraordinary social revolution on the ground, which of course Margaret much better exemplifies, getting married first proper royal to get divorced in 1978, and then earlier not being allowed to marry because Peter Townsend was divorced. So if we'd focused on that narrative, we'd have seen much more predictably what was going to happen. Arguably the real loser was Charles, because it was an impossible act to live up to in so many respects, Philip and Elizabeth, because it came from a different era. People didn't, but the propensity to turn a blind eye no longer existed. And the ability also, and we see this more clearly with Meghan, but it was sort of beginning under Diana, the ability to live outside the royal orbit with the celebrity era, which the Duke of Windsor sort of failed to do. It was a bit pitiful, was always a bit short of money. And
yes, we had Anne Sebber on talking about Wallis Simpson and all her books a few months ago, and a really fascinating time. We've got a comment here about the war. I was in a pushchair when a doodle bug fell and my father never got over it. I bet he
horrible.
thought he'd seen your last moments. What a terrifying thing there. We're out of time, Tessa. I could talk to you all day. And I
feel the problem is I'm just bending down because my battery's low. Not mine literally, but on my laptop. Let me just plug in. But can I just say, if you want to see Pat on if you tune in your television, I don't know how you find GB News, but anyway, I don't know what the numbers on the station are, but we're on with Andrew Pierce and Pat, who's 99, I'm going to have to now go and meet.
Excellent.
So if anybody wants to go and watch that in half an hour, I think we're on at 1:30. That should be taking place.
I just want to remind you,
what about GB News? Let me just see.
We've just said fascinating conversation. What a fab session, lots of laughs, as well as some.
Why not Lucinda? Better than The Crown. Yeah, The Crown. Oh, that's
I'll
fun.
tell you about Princess
Thank you.
Louise.
Oh, here we are. It's 237 on Freeview. There you go. So you can see Pat, who is a Bletchley girl, and her sister, who's not here, Jean, was a fanny. She was the girl in Italy that was getting groped, writing to her sister Pat, but she won't talk about that. Pat, she's right for proper. Actually quite posh. But Jean isn't here because she's in Lancashire. But I think they're the last two sisters alive who both signed the Official Secrets Act. And Pat's being brought in from Chiswick by a carer aged 99, so I should go too.
Well, I hope you have a wonderful time. Thank you, everybody. This is
Oh, I've just got to, is that your book next week?
It's
Richard Coles.
We're reading this. Everybody read this. Murder Before Evensong. We'll be back to a classic the following month. Thank you, Tessa. You have been wonderful. Take care, everybody. I will see you soon, and we'll speak. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. 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 Bye.